Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Antonia Ypsilanti. I'm an associate professor in cognitive psychology at Sheffield Hallam University. I am also the co-director of the campaign to end loneliness. Really excited to be here today to bring this session to you, exploring the findings from the recent report from BPE on the low well-being in the UK, which provides a start insight into the state of well-being, its drivers, and the economic impact. So in this session, we will begin by hearing from BPE's chief economist, John Franklin. We will hear about the key findings of the reports, and then we will have the expert panel, which will reflect on these findings and the policy recommendations that we can derive from this, focusing on the impact of chronic loneliness on overall levels of well-being and the potentially transformative impact of services and policy change to tackle loneliness. So we have an amazing and fantastic lineup of speakers here today. But before I just go on to introduce them, I wanted to say a few words about housekeeping issues. So the event today is being recorded and will be available on the Pro Bono Economics website and the YouTube channel after the session. You will have some time for audience questions at the end of the session. So please do submit them in the chat as we go along, and we'll capture all of them, as many as we can in the end. The low well-being in the UK report is now out and available on the PBE website. So a link should be on the chat right now. And we'd love for you to post anything about events on social media. If you do so, just please use our hashtag. So hashtag BP events. I hope this is all clear. So we have a fantastic lineup of speakers today. So let me just tell you a little bit about each of them. So first of all, we have Amrik Singh Ubi, who is the Director of Civic Engagement and Partnerships at Nishcombe Civil Association. So welcome, Amrik. We also have John Franklin, who is the Chief Economist at Pro Bono Economics, who is going to deliver the first short speech on the presentation of the report. So thank you, John, for doing that for us and summarizing the main findings of the report. We also have, we are welcoming Kate Joplin, who is an independent policy and strategy consultant, but has worked on loneliness extensively. We have collaborated with Kate Joplin at the Campaign to End Loneliness. She has worked at the campaign before we even took over the campaign. So thank you, Kate, for joining us. And lastly, we have Phil Jackson, who is the CEO and founder of Ghoul Youth Action. So he's going to talk about the youth perspective on this topic. So we are ready to get started. So I'm going to hand over to PPE's John Franklin to give us an overview of the research and key findings from the report. So thank you, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will just give it a moment for the slides to come up. There we go. Thank you very much, and thank you for the introduction. So Pro Bono Economics are a charity and think tank. We use data, evidence, and the skills of economists to support organisations trying to tackle the causes and consequences of low well-being in the UK. And this immediately raises the question, why as an organisation have we tailored our entire sort of mission and purpose around tackling low well-being? And our answer to that very much comes into, well, what do you mean by well-being? How do you measure that? What are we trying to capture? Now, people's initial reactions, unless they've been around the well-being space for a long time, can often be thinking about people doing yoga on beach and aromatherapy, because that's the kind of common everyday language that people use in typical conversations. When they think about well-being, they're talking about the wellness industry and what that means. But I think the science around well-being and well-being measurement has developed rapidly in the UK over the last 10, 20 years. And actually, frankly, it means something a lot less woolly and a lot less fluffy when we think about it. This slide is nabbed from the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and they define well-being as how we're feeling and how we're functioning. And that captures a whole host of things. So from the satisfaction of fundamental needs, so do we feel safe? Do we feel connected to other people? It captures the external conditions we're facing, so that might be around your work and your income. It could be about the housing or the local environment that you live with. It could be your personal resources, such as your health or your self-esteem and confidence. Or it could be about your feelings from a day-to-day basis. So are you feeling happy? Are you feeling anxious? Ultimately, it's about what matters to people. And this is why we care about it as an organization, because we think it's a great umbrella term, an umbrella approach for capturing basically people's fundamental quality of life in the UK. And like most charities, that's kind of what we care about ultimately, is supporting people, supporting their quality of life, so that people can lead happy, fulfilled lives. And this is why we wrote this report focused on people with the lowest well-being in the UK, because we believe those are the people that are struggling the most. Those are the people with the worst quality of life. And those are the people that are likely to need support from not just the social sector, but the government, and also a compassionate private sector as well. So when we talk about well-being, more specifically, how do we measure that within the UK? Now, the approach in the UK has developed rapidly, and it started back in 2011 when the Office of National Statistics finished up their consultation exercise on how do we measure progress in the UK, how do we capture well-being or quality of life within the UK. And there were a number of steps taken forward at that time, but one of the key ones was the introduction of 4 personal well-being questions, which are shown on the screen here at the moment. So overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? Overall, how happy did you feel yesterday? And overall, how anxious did you feel yesterday? And these are really simple questions, but they cover, I guess, the fundamental dimensions of philosophical dimensions, if you like, of well-being. It goes right back to kind of Greek philosophy and thinking about, well, what really matters in people's lives. But importantly, they're about asking people about their experience. It's asking them to judge how satisfied they are with their lives based on what they see as important, rather than saying, actually, these are the things that must matter in your life, and we're going to measure those, and it's us that decide what matters. No, we're kind of turning it over and asking other people, well, what's your experience? How is your quality of life on an everyday basis? And I think that's a great way of understanding how we're doing as a society and what really matters to people as well. Now, for the purposes of our report, we have focused specifically on one of these measures. So that's the one highlighted in orange. Overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Now, we'll be the first ones to admit that there is no single measure that can capture the full richness of life and the full richness of what matters in people's lives. But of these measures, that one has been one of the ones that has been most used for well-being research. And that's because it tends to be relatively stable over time. So it's not something that fluctuates rapidly, unlike the how happy you feel and how anxious you feel. Yes, those are capturing sort of shorter term mood and feelings that can fluctuate quite quickly. But it's far more focused on things that are reflective and reflect kind of slower, steadier changes in people's lives. It's also the measure that took quite a prominent role in the Treasury's guidance that was released back in 2021 around how to measure the impact of government policies using wellbeing approaches. And it was this particular measure that was chosen as one of the leading measures for wellbeing within that. And in particular, it was this measure that was used for putting a pounds and pence value, a monetary value, against improvements in wellbeing as well. So focused in on this single measure, we accept that that is giving us a partial picture and doesn't give us the fully rounded picture, but it has been demonstrated to respond to the kinds of things that we'd expect to matter in people's quality of life. And we'll come on to that in a moment. So what does the data on well-being tell us? Well, high level, when we look at the averages, actually, the average person in the UK is doing pretty well. Based on the ONS breakdown of that score, and I should have said, these questions are all measured on a scale of 0 to 10, where, for instance, on that life satisfaction question, 0 is completely unsatisfied, and 10 is completely satisfied with your life. 0 is not satisfied at all, and 10 is completely satisfied. If we look at the average score, it's around 7.5 in the UK, which, based on the ONS definitions, would put the average person in the UK as having a high level of well-being. So actually, on average, we're doing okay. That's been pretty stable over time since that data has been gathered. So 2012 was the first full calendar year of data that we've got using the annual population survey, which is the official source for wellbeing data in the UK. And it rose steadily from 2012 up to around 2019, from around 7.5 to 7.8. We then saw a dip following the impact of the pandemic in 2020. So it dropped back down from 7.8 back to about 7.5. And it has remained stuck at this lower level since then, particularly when we look at calendar year data. So been stuck at around 7.5 since that point. But relatively stable, actually a relatively high level on average. Now that drop off in well-being of around 0.3 points may not sound much, but is quite substantial, particularly when you think that's on average across all of the 55 million adults in the UK. One of the best research impacts on life satisfaction, on well-being, is somebody losing their job. Entering unemployment is roughly equivalent to losing around half a point on that life satisfaction scale. So given that on average, every adult in the UK has lost 0.3 points, which is not quite as much as losing your job, it gives you that sense of scale, though, that actually that drop-off is quite big as a kind of overall gross reduction in well-being across all of the adults in the UK. That is quite substantial. It's not far off, half the people losing their jobs or something that kind of scale in terms of the impact on well-being. So even at the average level, when we look overall, we can see some changes, and some changes that are a little concerning, particularly when we see that lack of recovery in well-being over time. But I think what's more interesting than the averages is what sits underneath them, because underneath that average hides significant inequality of experience in terms of well-being. So on this chart, we've broken down the well-being scores. The dark blue is people with high or very high levels of well-being. So those are people that are scoring 7 or above on that 0 to 10 scale. The pale blue are those people with medium levels of well-being. So they are scoring 5 or 6 on that scale. And the pink bars at the bottom, that is the proportion of people experiencing low well-being. And these are the people that are scoring 0 to 4 on that scale. So that's a really low quality of life. And what we're seeing is that whilst on average, the average person in the UK might be experiencing a high level of well-being, scoring around 7.5. There is a significant minority, quite persistently over time, that are experiencing really quite a low quality of life. So around 1 in 20 people are scoring 4 or below on that life satisfaction scale. And that's a pretty clear indication that these are the people that are going to have a poor quality of life, and we really need to be thinking about society, how do we support them more effectively? To give a sense of scale, so 1 in 20 people, that's the equivalent of around 3.2 million adults living with low well-being in 2023. That's around the populations of Liverpool and Manchester added together, just to give you that kind of sense of scale of this. And that number is probably at the highest level that we have seen since this data was started to be collected back in the second half of 2011. And that's a combination of, as we saw that drop off in average level of well-being during the pandemic, we saw an uptick in terms of the proportion of people experiencing low well-being. So it's currently sitting around 5.7%, hasn't dropped back down to the levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. So we've got a higher proportion experiencing low well-being, plus a bit of a population growth in terms of the number of adults we've got in the UK, means that 3.2 million is probably the highest number in terms of absolute terms of adults that we've had to deal with in terms of experiencing low well-being in the UK since that data was started to be gathered. It's around 135,000 more people than there were in 2022, and around 780,000 more adults experiencing low well-being in 2023 compared to prior to the pandemic in 2019. So who are these people? Who are these people that are experiencing low well-being? Well, we know that they're disproportionately likely to be female rather than male. So it's a small difference, but it is a notable difference there. They're more likely to be middle-aged than to be either younger or older adults. They're more likely to be from non-white ethnicities. So in particular, mixed ethnicities are particularly at risk of low well-being. They're more likely to be from the lowest quartile in terms of household income. So they're more likely to be poor. They're more likely to be unemployed or inactive, particularly inactive due to poor health. And they're more likely to be disabled. So that starts to give us a kind of a bit of a feel of what are these groups. But there are 3 kind of characteristics that jump out time and again whenever we look at what are these drivers of low well-being, what are the factors that seem to stand out as being most strongly predictive of somebody experiencing a low quality of life. And those are mind, body, and connection. So people's mental health, their physical health, and their loneliness or their sense of social connection. These are the factors that keep jumping out as being absolutely critical. So this chart we're showing on screen, this is taken from our report that was published a couple of weeks ago. And in this piece of analysis, we've tried to use a statistical approach that sort of teases apart those different drivers of well-being and isolate them. So we can say, what's the impact of this particular driver holding everything else constant? Now, it's not perfect, but it gives us an indication of what are the strongest predictors of low well-being. And no matter what year we look at this, no matter how we break this down, what definition of low well-being we're using, the things that keep jumping out are those things highlighted with the pink bars there, which are around people's mental health, their loneliness, and their physical health. So having mental health difficulties that impact your life all of the time increases your risk of experiencing low well-being by 16 percentage points compared to somebody who doesn't experience that, whose mental health impacts their life none of the time. Having very good health reduces the risk of experiencing low well-being by 15 percentage points compared to somebody with good health. And likewise, having poor general health increases the risk of experiencing low well-being by around 9 percentage points. And feeling lonely all of the time, as opposed to none of the time or never, or hardly any of the time or never, increases the risk by around 13 percentage points. And you can see that the kind of scale of those bars just give the sense of how much more of an impact they are having compared to a number of other factors that people might typically worry about. And in particular, some of the economic impacts, which are one of the or economic factors which can dominate kind of discussions about what matters. So people's income didn't even come into this chart. Unemployment does matter, but it's having a much smaller impact than some of those more the mind, body, and connection issues that we've already highlighted. So these factors really are the ones that seem to jump out time and time again. And what's even worse is if we look at combinations of these factors, so people facing multiple difficulties are at even higher risk. So for those people that aren't experiencing any of those key risk factors, the mind, body, and connection, mental health difficulties, the physical health difficulties, or challenges around loneliness, only around 3 in every 100 people would experience low well-being within a given year, so around 3%. If they experience one of those factors, then there is more likely that around 15% of people would experience low well-being. With 2 of those risk factors, so physical and mental health difficulties, or loneliness and mental health difficulties, then that risk increases to around 37% of people would experience low well-being. And if you've got all 3 of those risk factors, if you're struggling with your mental health and your physical health and you're feeling lonely, then around 2/3 of adults would be experiencing low well-being based on the analysis we've done. So these are the kind of really critical factors that jump out as drivers of low well-being, and combinations of them have an even bigger impact over time. Now, as an organisation here at PBE, we think that tackling low well-being should be a major policy priority. We think that setting targets for how we reduce well-being over time, how we reduce the numbers of people struggling with low well-being over time, should be a really important part of what government does. And we would love to see that driven down to nothing. We don't want anybody to be living with that really poor quality of life. But we know that would take time, and I think it may never be possible to get it right down to zero. But to give us an indication of the value that this would have, applying the Treasury's own guidance for how we put a value on changes in well-being, if we could just halve the number of people experiencing low well-being in the UK, it would deliver 54 billion in economic benefits every year. And that's based on the Treasury's own methodology. So it really would make an enormous difference to the experience people have. And we can put that into this sort of monetary terms to indicate, well, what's the value of that to people? So we can trade it off against the costs and against other opportunities, other ways that we could improve people's life. But if we can tackle low well-being, it would make a substantial difference to the quality of people's lives. How would we get there? How would we start to make the difference? Well, I mean, it seems clear to us that given those important drivers of mental health, physical health, and loneliness, those seem like really obvious and important places to start in terms of tackling low well-being and driving the numbers down over time. And in fairness to the new government, right from the start, when they laid out their missions, there has been a strong focus on improving the health system and improving physical health and shortening waiting lists for physical health conditions. And they have talked a reasonable amount about giving greater parity to mental health within the health system as well, and directing more resources to providing support around mental health. And those two things, if the government could deliver on that mission, would make a substantial difference in terms of tackling levels of low wellbeing in the UK. But there's one of those three key drivers where it feels like the new government coming in has been a lot quieter, and that's around loneliness. And we think that that is definitely worth a bit of a rethink in terms of policy priorities. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about loneliness, and I think that's certainly something that would be good to pick up with the panel when we get into the discussion in a moment. So, loneliness in the UK. There are various different ways of measuring it, and it's fair to say there's quite a lot of debate about what is the right way of measuring loneliness. For our purposes, we have used Understanding Society's measure of loneliness, which is a direct measure. It asks people, how often do you feel lonely? And there are 3 levels that you can choose from as part of that survey, going from often to sometimes to hardly ever or never. If we look at those people that are saying that they often feel lonely, that trend in terms of the number of people appears to have been going up over time based on Understanding Society data. And it means that in 2023, we estimate that there was just over 5 million adults living with chronic loneliness in the UK. Now, this is adults alone, doesn't focus on young people as well. And it's fair to say that the last couple of years of data, at the time we did this analysis, Understanding Society only went to 2022, and we projected forward using the Opinions and Lifestyle Survey. So the last couple of years are a little bit tentative, but we have just seen the latest results from the Community Life Survey, which sort of confirm that there seems to be a pretty strong upward trend in terms of the number of adults experiencing loneliness at the moment. And that should be a real concern for the government and for us as a society. So if we've got around 5 million people, this has enormous personal costs for those individuals. You know, loneliness is a horrible experience. We had some case studies included in our report, which kind of portray what that feels like and the difference it made to people's lives. But it also has an implication in terms of other policy priorities that the government might want to achieve. So not least, you know, a focus on the health system, where people who are chronically lonely typically make greater use of health services. And you know, if you can isolate the impact of that chronic loneliness and just focus on the difference that that's making, let alone, you know, potential other issues that come around it, then we think around 1 million additional GP appointments are made every year as a result of chronic loneliness. So if we could reduce chronic loneliness, it would make a real difference to the demands being faced by the health system as well. So what can the government do about it? Now, back in 2018, the Theresa May government published a loneliness strategy. And it was, I guess, another step on the process, the progress that has been made in recognising loneliness as an important public health issue. It recognised the impacts it can have on people's lives and gave a sense of scale in terms of the difference it makes and the impact, for example, on mortality of people from the experience of loneliness. And really started to give it the recognition as a policy issue that it deserves. We, in the run-up to writing this report, we wanted to speak to a number of people working around the sector, around the loneliness sector, both in the social sector and elsewhere, and understand their kind of take on the strategy and what has happened since. I think it's fair to say most of the people we spoke to really recognised that strategy back in 2018 as being a landmark moment in terms of recognising loneliness as a public health issue. But there was a general sense that the delivery off the back of it feels like it's been a bit slow, and that as a policy issue, it seems to be losing a bit of momentum. And there were kind of 3 key points that really came out as challenges to particularly many of the social sector organisations that were working in the sector. And the first one is around funding. So it was often people talked about funding in this area being too short term, too fragmented. And that created real instability in the ability to run programs and interventions to support loneliness within local communities. So the fact that they couldn't be planning longer term, the fact that the programs had to fit in with, you know, short term fragments of funding that they could find, created real difficulties making sustained longer term differences to people's lives and tackling the loneliness issue. The second issue that was raised was around collaboration between local authorities, healthcare services, and community organisations, where it felt this was kind of really fraught with difficulties in many areas. So, and that was a combination of things. There was aligning those national initiatives with local needs, and aligning the local provision with various different commissioning models that might come from the different stakeholders that were involved and different people that might have an interest in loneliness. So tackling that ability to collaborate within those local communities felt like a real priority as well. And finally, a lot of organisations talked about the difficulties of providing robust data to demonstrate the effectiveness, their effectiveness in tackling loneliness. And it seemed to be a combination. There were some very loneliness-specific issues around what's the right measure to use, what is the measure that matters to people, but also a lot of the kind of general issues that we see as an organisation with small and medium-sized charities in terms of skills, capacity, and understanding, and just having the resources in order to really use data effectively. So, as a starter for 10, we want to do more work on loneliness. I'm sure we as an organisation will have more to say, and we'd love to hear more from other people about this. But here were kind of 3 key things that we thought would help as a starting place for increasing the priority placed on loneliness within the policy environment. So, first of all, refreshing and strengthening the policy framework around loneliness. The strategy back in 2018 was really important. We don't think there's necessarily a need for a new strategy, but definitely a clearer plan coming out of government, a clearer cross-departmental plan coming out of government on how they're going to take that agenda forward and how that's going to be taken more seriously going forwards. This could be aligned with greater accountability, clearer measures on outcomes as well. I think we need to increase collaboration within philanthropic funding. This funding challenge that kept coming up needs to be addressed. Now, we need to be realistic. It's not going to be a time where the government is going to have lots and lots of extra money to pile into this, but potentially greater collaboration, potentially matched funding between some of the government programs and philanthropic funding funders that are out there, and greater coordination between them could help to really kind of concentrate support around loneliness as an issue that needs tackling. And I think what gets funded also matters. There's a lot of talk, and has been a lot of talk, about social prescribing, and I think a lot of people recognise that it does have an important role to play, but it's not the only solution to loneliness. And I think greater need to invest in exploring and understanding some alternative routes to tackling loneliness, potentially using digital platforms, digital tools, could make a huge difference as well. And finally, support on measurement and setting realistic expectation about what we want to see from community organisations working on loneliness to help them demonstrate their impact. Now, DCMS is already doing a review of some of the loneliness measures and which ones are most appropriate for measuring the impact of particular interventions, and that's great. But I think that is only one component of what needs doing in order to engage and support those community organisations working on loneliness, so they know what's a realistic set of best practice, what would that look like, and giving them a fair chance to make their case for the funding and support they need within those kind of local networks and more broadly. Now, I'm sure there'll be lots of other great ideas from the panel members on what else needs doing in order to address loneliness in the UK. This is our kind of start of 10 to get people thinking about it. But ultimately, as I said before, PB believes that nobody should be experiencing low wellbeing in the UK. This is a kind of policy priority in terms of tackling what matters most to people and addressing that through the actions that all 3 sectors, both private, social, and state sectors, can make in tackling this important issue. It feels like loneliness is potentially the area of those kind of 3 key ones that is not getting quite the attention it deserves at the moment. Hopefully these kind of first 3 steps that laid out here provide a starting place for thinking about what could be done going forwards to strengthen that. But if we can tackle chronic loneliness, if we can make a difference to that, then that will be a really important step in driving down the levels of low wellbeing in the future.
Thank you, John. Thank you for summarising the findings. Very interesting. We have a few questions for our expert panels now to start the discussion, and then we will follow that from the audience with a few questions from the audience. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so shall we start? So I'm going to address the first question to Amrik, and I wanted to ask you, Amrik, if these 3 key factors that were just highlighted by the BPE report, the mind, body, and connection, Do you think that these feel like critical drivers of well-being in the communities that you work with?
Thanks, Antonio, and thank you very much, John, for that context and great summary of some very detailed work. Much appreciated. Mind, body, and connection, absolutely crucial. Leaving any one of those out would be so detrimental and so dangerous that we'd be chasing red herrings for eternity. I'm privileged that I belong to a group of organizations. The Nishkam group is made up of a place of worship, a school trust, a health trust, a community cooperative, and also the civic arm here that I'm pleased to be part of. And people present themselves in different ways. People don't just knock on your door and say, I'm lonely. People don't just walk up to you and say, I have a problem with my mind or with my body. People will present themselves as complex beings. It is up to us to make sure that we have joined up thinking and are able to look at the holistic approach when dealing with well-being. Here, we specifically talk, as a faith-inspired and faith-based organization, we specifically talk about mind, body, and spirit, because we think our spirits are all connected. Therefore, that's the connection link that I would make back to the work that John's just presented. So it's crucial for us to appreciate the deep interconnectedness between physical health, community, and spiritual well-being for us to make sure that we clearly understand that true health is not just about the absence of illness. True health comes through making sure that everybody has equity, everybody has access, and everybody feels appreciated and a sense of belonging. And what we found that when you talk about loneliness, you talk about mental health, you talk about stress, these factors are not always internally driven. The fact that we have a world in crisis, whether that's the cost of living crisis, whether that's wars going on in the Middle East, whether that's trauma in families, all this adds to the complexity and the problems that we need to solve. I think it's important to remember that loneliness, and we'll tackle it later, I'm sure, isn't always understood the same in all communities and all cultures. For example, I could pose that question that John was posing earlier about where are you on this continuum? If I ask that question of an elderly Sikh person, first generation, he would say, of course I'm not lonely. There's 12 people living in this house. But if I said to him, how do you feel on a day-to-day basis? Do you feel as though you belong? Are you respected? Are you consulted? Are you engaged? The answer will be very different. And that spectrum, on that answer on that spectrum, would also be very different. I think loneliness has certainly shown us in our work that it's an epidemic. It's an epidemic at horrible figures are coming through. We have complex medical conditions that are hiding it. We have GP and hospital waiting times that are adding to it. We have mental health challenges and problems that lead to more appointments being missed and a vicious circle of downward spiral and despair beginning. We are more connected as humans than we've ever been, and we're probably more lonely than we've ever been. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Amrik. Thank you and for pointing out the way that we ask these questions, the way that we phrase these questions is really, really important. So thank you for pointing that out. And okay, so just wanted to move to Kate and asking a more general question. Like, Kate, out of these three key drivers, loneliness was the most important one. So why do you think loneliness is such a challenge in the UK?
Yeah, thank you. And just apologies in advance, there's some background noise just started up just as I'm about to speak. I think loneliness is really, really important. I've spent a lot of my time working on it because I think it is really critically important. So it's really brilliant to see Pro Bono Economics drawing attention to it and highlighting not only its connection to wellbeing, but onwards into kind of real economic impacts too. So that's really welcome. I mean, I think just one thing I always like to just be really clear about when we're talking about loneliness, one of the reasons it's such an emotive subject and such a big topic for a lot of people is because we all understand it. Most of us, if not all of us, have experienced it in our lives. But when we're talking about loneliness in a sort of public policy context, we're not talking about a fleeting experience of loneliness that sadly most of us experience, and it was hard, but we move through it. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about the loneliness that really impacts well-being. And it's clear in the statistics, we're talking about those people that experience loneliness often or always. And it is something that's extremely individual and is impacted by a whole range of other factors in our lives. And so I'm not at all surprised to see how important loneliness was, but also to recognise that the people who are experiencing loneliness are often the people that are also living in poverty, also the people that are also experiencing marginalisation for other reasons, including being part of a racialised community. They're also the people that are living in poor housing or experiencing job insecurity. All of these factors impact our experience of loneliness, and particularly whether our experience of a disconnecting thing that happens in our lives. We all go through them different times in our lives where we become more or less connected to one another, either physically or emotionally. But our resilience and our ability to get through those things is impacted by a whole bunch of other factors. So for me, loneliness is a really kind of important human issue to get hold of. But let's not confuse ourselves that normal experience, that everyday experience that we can experience from one moment to the next, is what we're talking about when we're talking about the problematic loneliness that needs addressing in public policy. And that's always the caution I want to start with in these conversations.
Thank you, Kate. Yes, so we are talking about what is known more widely as chronic loneliness, or there are other terms like persistent loneliness or problematic loneliness. So there are various terms, and there is quite a vibrant research environment at the moment looking into measuring chronic loneliness and so on. So that's really good to bring in. So can I move now to Phil? And Phil, I wanted to ask you, so you work for a charity that directly support people facing loneliness and experiencing low well-being. How is loneliness experienced by the young people you work with? And how does that impact their overall health and well-being?
Thanks so much, Antonia. Welcome, everyone. We run a charity in Goole in East Riding, Yorkshire, just for context. It's an area of high deprivation. It's got the attributes of many areas in the country. Low aspirations, low skill base. The burden of social media on young people is a major pressure. Lack of youth provision, these sort of things. But in terms of loneliness, we see it growing, not reducing. A lot of young people that we work with, and we're working closely one-to-one and in small groups on our projects, have poor family relationships, undiagnosed developmental disorders. Some of them are young carers. Some of them have newly diagnosed medical conditions. There's cultural differences that are in play in Goole with a large multicultural community. In terms of the school life, that's tougher. The rules, the regulations that schools are putting on young people are sometimes such that they're at breaking points. We work a lot of young people on the cusp of education, excluded and then accepted back or expelled. So what we see is a lot of young people presenting high levels of depression, anxiety, sleep problems, and stress. And that goes on to show in low self-confidence, sometimes into antisocial behavior, and it really does sort of build up. One of the coping strategies that we find is actually a lot of vaping. The vaping almost all the time. It's one of the things they do. We have an emotional wellbeing support service. It's a pilot. We've got a worker. She's not a counsellor. She's an emotional wellbeing worker. But that's gone absolutely through the roof in terms of referrals. We're only able to provide 3 hours a week of support, but all the slots are always taken. And one of the things that we do use is the Warwick Edinburgh Emotional Wellbeing Scale, which I don't know if watchers and listeners are aware of, but that's really, really useful for measuring and showing differences in well-being and loneliness. not only to show young people how much they've travelled, but also to funders. We are struggling, as previous speakers have said, about funding, and spend a lot of time chasing funding. And I'm very keen to get the evidence to show the difference that we make in our projects. And that is one tool that I would highly recommend to look at.
Thank you very much for that. And I think this links back to John's presentation about the combination of these risk factors being key drivers. So if we combine all of those independent risk factors, and like you were saying, Phil, for example, some of your young people might have more than one risk factors, that kind of doubles or even elevates even further their well-being levels as well. So that's really important to mention. And going back to Amrik, can I just ask you, Amrik, how do you see the impact of loneliness in your civic engagement and community building work at Nishcom?
Thank you, Antonia, and again, thanks to Phil for that great contribution, because it reminds me of so much and some of the similarities that our organizations, our communities are facing. But at the same time, as well as similarities, we see distinct contrast as well, distinct differences in needs, depending on the demographics, depending on the ethnicity, depending on the location and the personal circumstances of everybody that presents themselves. So on that, I would yet again give a word of caution and a caveat here to say, let's not look at one size fits all. It's very, very important that our work is in localities, in locations, in communities that must be very specific and must be appreciated. If I can just go back and go back to a point John made earlier about on average, I think when we work with averages, it's very, very dangerous because of some of the points I made earlier. I remember an analogy from a previous life as a consultant. We used to use an analogy that went something like this. If I have two buckets of water, one with boiling water, one with ice cold water, and I put 1 foot in each bucket, on average, I am comfortable. I may have one scalded foot and I might have frostbite on the other. On average, I should be comfortable. So that to me tells me that we need policymakers to appreciate that the data is the data, but there will be specific nuances that need addressing. And loneliness is very, very complex. Societal pressures are huge, and we're seeing resilience going the opposite way. It's going down, not up. So it's about how do we create those safe spaces. We might not be setting out to tackle loneliness. We might just be setting out to be good human beings and having a good, hospitable environment where people feel welcome, people feel at home, and they feel as though they can contribute in a meaningful way. So it's about how do we engage people more, and how do we look at volunteering? Because volunteering is a great tool for combating loneliness. Not only does it cure the loneliness, it actually cures a person being served and the person receiving the service. And people won't always come to us and say, I feel lonely, as I said earlier, but we will notice that they may have low mood, or they may be self-reporting to have low mood, or they've lost their mojo, or they're not on form. So I think it's about how we look at this from different lenses in the workplace, in the school, in the place of worship. We all talk about first aid mental health training. Genuinely scratch the surface when somebody says, I'm all right, and say, are you really okay? Because when we ask that, people will actually sit down and say, well, now that you ask, no, I'm not okay. And we find people present like this through the services we provide at the coalface, whether that's debt advice, whether that's housing advice, whether that's financial job loss advice or whatever. When you scratch that surface, you open up and start delayering that onion, as we call it, you get to the core of what the problem is. And that core might be loneliness at home, might be a mental health challenge, might be DV issues, but there's a whole complex issue that we should be very careful that we don't try and solve world hunger just by trying to tackle loneliness. Thank you, Antonia.
Thank you, Amrik. Very useful, which leads me nicely to like you were talking about the complexity of loneliness, and this kind of prompts me to ask Kate about what her thoughts are on how charities or the social sector or the sector as a whole, how can we tackle these challenges, and how can collaboration across the sector, including the public and private sector, how can that help, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely an issue which requires a collaborative solution. So I often say that the solutions to loneliness are as diverse as people are, and that's because loneliness is a completely individual experience. It depends not only on the quantity and quality of our relationships, but also our own expectations and needs and wants. So what will address your loneliness won't address mine. Also because we're different people, and we need to find our people in different places. And so I think Amrik's absolutely right. You know, there is no one size fits all solution here. But the other really important point, and the point that I think particularly speaks to the need for cross-sector working, is that actually there are many different roles we need to play. I would refer you to the Promising Approaches framework, which I created for the Campaign to End Loneliness in Age UK, if you want more detail on this. But what that tries to set out is that there are some particular kinds of approaches that we can take which will directly impact someone's loneliness. And those are the ones where we're supporting people to build new connections, or to reinforce their existing connections, or to support them psychologically around the way that they connect with people. That is going to make a direct difference. But if we don't have the right infrastructure in our community, the right transport, the right digital infrastructure, the right housing, the right public spaces, then none of that will work. And so I think, you know, there really is a role for everybody. We do need to know what role we're playing. We need to coordinate our efforts. Not all of us are the right people to directly interface with the most lonely individuals, but all of us, whether we're social sector, whether we're private sector, whether we're public sector, can play a role in helping to be part of that loneliness solution. And I think it's not about everything saying it's about loneliness. Loads of the most effective loneliness interventions were set up for health, for education, for a whole bunch of other reasons. But it is about recognising what role we're playing so we can coordinate properly.
Thank you, Kate, which leads me nicely to just a question for both Phil and Amrik from their side. What are these policy changes that you would like to see that would have an impact on the service that is provided for young people on one hand? For Phil, that's the question for Phil, but also for Nishkam for the work that you provide. So should we start with Phil? What are the policy changes that you would like to see that would facilitate your work with young people?
Thank you. The government have recently announced a 180 million injection into youth outcomes through the youth strategy. Just in terms of context, I'm a service manager from a local authority where I think the amount of youth services money was spent was like 500 million. So it's way short of what it needs to be. A lot of discussion about the need for local youth provision. I mean, that's a well-documented argument, and people are realising the benefits of youth services now and the loss that it's been over the last 5 to 10 years. So there are some encouraging policy announcements. One of the interesting ones was the National Citizen Service going, which I would say actually from our perspective is something that would be applauded, because that was about a very short term and contact with young people, not building strong relationships via trusted adults and youth workers. So that could be welcome. So if that money could be diverted into real close support to young people, I'm not talking about youth clubs here and the under 11s, the very nice village kind of youth provision that's been portrayed in the past, but real intensive one-to-one and small group work where you actually engage in the whites of eyes and the real lives of young people. That's where the real successes can be made and really start to improve well-being and lack of isolation, really.
Thank you. Amrik, what policy changes would you like to see that would impact your work?
Thank you for that. I think we've touched upon long-term sustainable investment. I think what we see and have seen with many governments, and we're seeing it now in Birmingham City Council, with we're constantly robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's false economy. We're dragging people out of the river, constantly fishing them out. But the same colleagues who work for the same department, the same organization, are the ones throwing them in the river upstream. Why don't we just go upstream and work together and say, look, don't throw that person in. We can actually do an intervention with them. So to put that into practice, let's have some recognition that downstream costs and the impact on downstream costs can be prevented by tackling upstream problems. Let's look at stop cutting investment in youth programs. Let's stop cutting investments in services and saying, we'll do care in the community. That's rhetoric. We want to see action. If you're going to do care in the community, let's do care in the community properly. And care in the community is not about burdening institutions, faith-based and otherwise, who are doing great work, but asking them to do care in the community. Care in the community must come with collaboration and with budget. It cannot keep coming at the cost of, it's your moral duty to look after these people. It's your moral duty to serve. Yes, it is, and we will continue doing that. However, we've got to be able to look and put some sustainable programs in place where, through collaboration with public agencies, health authorities, ICSs, ICBs, and with local councils, we're addressing those problems. And again, I will say the importance of intergenerational work and cannot be underestimated, because not only does that keep the elderly old and the young getting wiser, it gives opportunity for engagement, it gives opportunities for volunteering, it gives opportunities for learning and breaking that cycle of despair and that cycle of loneliness. Thank you.
And that captures as well the two quite lonely age groups, the younger people and the older people, in a very nice way. Kate, would you like to make a final comment? What would you kind of want to highlight before we end the talk today and go to a couple of questions in the chat?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the only thought I have to add to the excellent points that have been made and the you know, kind of rousing call to action from Amrit just now is I would slightly differ from what John had to say about whether we need a new strategy, because in my view, you know, 2018 was many years ago, and I think it is time for the government to refresh its strategy on loneliness. And I think, you know, John, you quite rightly highlighted the government missions and the way of working that they want to kind of move to in health, but they're not going to achieve their health mission without some serious action on loneliness, in my opinion, because actually for so many people, loneliness and the connection is what matters to them. And if you will work through what matters to people, you will encourage the action that people need to maintain their health and to rebuild their well-being, to recover from mental health. And, you know, I've seen that time and time again, that it's not so much that loneliness is the issue that we need to work on. It's often a kind of linchpin for a whole range of ways of addressing what's going on in people's lives. So for me, I think we really do need that government focus and strategy. That's not about saying we need a money tree for loneliness as well as everything else. It's just about thinking really strategically about where are we spending money, and could we do that better in a way that takes connection and relationships seriously and uses the resource that we have in service of the thing that really matters to people and will help us unlock so many of the other issues that we're facing. Because as you say, this, you know, low well-being has serious economic impacts, and so we take these issues as kind of nice to have at our peril. So for me, I really do think it's time to step in and refresh that strategy and put that leadership back, because that was a strategy launched by the Prime Minister, and this is a cross-governmental responsibility, and we need that leadership. Yeah.
And also the figures that John showed, there is an increase since 2017 to 2024. So we're looking at a different type of loneliness, an increase in loneliness. So a refreshed strategy would probably be very wise decision. So I found five key areas today. That was a combination of what all the speakers talked about, a call for a nuanced approach to loneliness, which is very important, a government to refresh the strategy and increase the loneliness agenda as loneliness increases across time, emphasis from John on the economic benefits of doing so in society. So as you say, there is not a matter of putting money, you can save money from doing so. And then measurement issues that John also mentioned earlier on persistent loneliness and problematic loneliness. And I think, Phil, you touched upon the importance of funding for robust evidence of what works, because sometimes funding can be directed to showcase what the work that you're doing and how impactful that is. I think we have one question from the audience that I can ask everyone. So I'm interested in the housing options in the chart. Did you look at any housing types? And John, that probably starts with you: social housing, private rented houses, and if so, if you found anything specific about housing.
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting topic when it comes to well-being and low well-being, because I think it depends on whether you look at the sort of raw prevalence of low well-being across these different groups versus trying to disentangle the impacts of housing specifically compared to poverty or health or mental health. So when you look at the raw prevalence, then I understand people in social housing typically are more likely to experience low well-being. But when you control for levels of income and risk of being unemployed or inactive, physical health and mental health, actually social housing has a sort of protective impact on people's well-being compared to private rented housing. And that was one of the kind of interesting findings that we got when we looked at this, is that, there seems to be this question mark that people that live in private rented housing are experiencing lower well-being compared to, understandably, people that own property, but also people that are in social housing. There's kind of clear evidence that does have a protective impact on their well-being compared to people in the private rented market.
Thank you, John. That's really helpful. I think that's all we have time for right now. And thank you, everyone, for joining this and tuning in to watch us. And of course, a special thank you to all the speakers that we had today. Amrik, John, Kate, and Phil, thank you very much for being here today. This report is available on the BBE website. So if you want to read a bit more about the findings from the report, please find the link to the chat in the chat. I think it has been posted. And if you would like to hear more about events like this, please make sure that you sign up to the newsletter. There is a link for that in the chat. And thanks for watching us today, and goodbye.